Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Grow Pakistan's first digital episode. My name is Ghasharib Shoukat and I am your host for today. In today's episode, we will be talking about fertilizers and their impact in Pakistan's agricultural industry. Joining us today, we have Uzair Vakil from Azeem's Private Limited to talk more about this subject. Uzair, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty well. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah.
How are you doing?
Pleasure to have you as well. So why don't you introduce yourself and a little bit about the work that you do for our viewers?
Absolutely. So historically, we have been, at least my family's been a commodity trading company. So we dealt in a lot of pharmaceutical raw materials internationally, cellulose, viscose, staple fiber, and a lot of pulp-based commodities. After that, around 2017, we divested into fertilizer agriculture, and yes, been doing that since then. We currently represent many multinationals in Pakistan, and then promote their products, fertilizer products in Pakistan, and then we also do R&D, research and development for new fertilizers and new coatings of fertilizer as well.
Okay, very fascinating. So if I were to ask you regarding the fertilizer industry, a lot of people don't really know much about it. They know that it's a solid sector to invest in, but could you just tell myself and the viewers what are the misconceptions regarding fertilizer that are prevalent within the agricultural space and how did you come to learn?
So how I came to learn of them was, having no background in agriculture, just coming back from university doing this was of course a surprise. So you can say everything was a misconception because I didn't really know as much of what's actually going on. As I came to it, then you come to realize there are many misconceptions. The biggest one, you could say at least is a little bit specific, is the over application of nitrogenous fertilizers in Pakistan, which is one of the biggest issues. That was when you came about and you read about good fertilization practices and how one should fertilize their crops. You get all these studies, etc., and like about balanced nutrition, about what actually should be done, and versus what's actually happening in Pakistan. There's a very, very big difference between the two. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions. I thought that the fertilizer community and the fertilizer products that are being used would actually be extremely advanced. But whereas Pakistan में हमारे पास सिर्फ दो phrase हैं, काला दाना होता है, सफ़ेद दाना, and not much of actually what fertilizer is. So that's one of them.
Okay, very interesting. So you talked about Kala Dana and Safed Dana. I just want our viewers to understand a little bit about the type of fertilizers that are used within Pakistan. So could you just touch base on what kind of fertilizers are used in Pakistan primarily?
Absolutely. So urea is predominantly the most used fertilizer in Pakistan, the so-called Safed Dana.
Yeah.
And then DAP is the second. So
Is that the Kala Dana?
that's the Kala Dana.
Okay.
So I'll just get into a bit of a overall as to what fertilizer is.
Okay.
So fertilizer is any nutrient that's needed for a crop to grow. From the air you get your carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then fertilizer is basically the three components are N, P, and K. So there's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium.
Okay.
And
I'm
then,
going to stop you here for the users that may not be informed about these technical, chemical, or chemistry-based terms. Can you just break it down in simple words?
Of course. So these are elements that any crop would need to grow, and so आपको हवा से मिल जाते हैं carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and what you need to actually apply to the soil in nutrient form would be nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and then your secondary macronutrients would be sulfur, calcium, magnesium, and then there's a plethora of micronutrients that you also need for crops to grow. In Pakistan, as I said, urea is predominantly the most used fertilizer with about a 6 million ton capacity, overall offtake to 6 to, I would say 6.5, sometimes more. Then DAP is the second most used one with about 800,000 ton lagbag capacity in Pakistan, with the rest being imported to make in the middle of 1.6 to 2.2 million tons used. Then there is calcium ammonium nitrate, which Fatima produces. There is many types of nitrophos. Fatima also makes the nitrophos. Yes, and then these are basically the nitrogen and phosphoric fertilizers that are used. In potassium, there would be mainly SOP and MOP, which is muriate of potash and sulfate of potash.
Okay.
So,
again, very chemical heavy.
Yeah,
So
I apologize.
How about we just talk about which of these are made in Pakistan and which of these we are importing? So obviously urea and DAP, we know that largest in consumption. But can you just talk, and you talked about some of the figures of yearly consumption. So could you just maybe touch base on which are the ones that we're producing and which are the ones we're importing.
Absolutely. So we produce quite a bit of urea. We sometimes have had to import like this year, but not very, very often. We are able to meet our capacity almost. DAP, we have about 800,000 tons capacity, and the rest, about 800,000 to 1 million to 1.2 million, is imported into Pakistan.
Okay.
And then all Pakistan has no potassic rock, so it's mainly all the potash based fertilizers that you're using, they're mainly imported. So from Russia, Belarus, Germany, Canada, this is where most of the potassic
And what
fertilizer
about
comes
for
from.
the nitrogen-based ones?
So nitrogen based ones, which is urea, is made by the Haber-Bosch process. It's made in Pakistan. Calcium ammonium nitrate, as I said, Fatima produces in Pakistan. And then nitrophos is also produced locally. Ammonium sulfate is another nitrogenous fertilizer that is imported. And that about covers the mass scale ones. There are many, many others to go into detail, but those are used in smaller quantities. These are what I brushed upon are the larger quantities used.
Okay, and who are the major players in the fertilizer space? Because often a lot of people say that it's not a fair trade industry, that's sort of monopolistic or oligarchic type of control that's exerted within the space. So if you were to touch on the main players and what the dynamics of the fertilizer industry are, I think it'll provide a lot of clarity for our viewers to understand how the space itself operates.
Absolutely. So our three largest players are Fauji, Engro, and Fatima. These three, and then Agritech also produces urea, but these are the three are the largest. Like they're the only urea producers in the country, and urea is the backbone of all your fertilizers. So these three companies are undoubtedly the largest. And then there are many other players in the market, such as Agven, Barkat, Premium Petroleum, many large traders in the business as well, who are currently supplying and then have their downstream businesses and their brands as well.
Yeah, but if we talk about sort of how the market is set up, so is it free market? How the controls?
So, I mean, free market. As you know, there's been a subsidy on natural gas. It just recently was removed, but historically there's been a very large subsidy on natural gas. So you cannot say that it's a perfectly free market, but which is an issue because essentially there were times in 2022 when the local price of urea was like $240 to $60 around that range. Internationally, it was 800. So it's extremely subsidized in Pakistan.
So what you're
This is at its peak.
Wow. So if you're saying that $800 was the actual market price, and we're selling that at 240 to 260, so that's like a quarter, right? So what I want to talk about is how sales in the fertilizer space operate, and if our area under cultivation stays the same year on year, how are fertilizer sales increasing? Because obviously a plant would require a certain amount of fertilization, right, for it to grow to its optimum level.
Absolutely.
But if you're over fertilizing it in the same amount of arable land, how does that add up? Wouldn't that sort of decrease our yields? This is a confusion I've had, so I just want to understand.
Sure. I'll speak about your first question first. How do sales in Pakistan work in the fertilizer industry? So usually they're pretty rigid structures that companies have. There's a regional manager. Underneath the regional manager, there's zonal managers, and with zonal managers, and they're like technical sales officers, etc. That basically there are two ways to do it. One way is that the technical sales officer would go directly to a farmer, and then he would give an order to the person, then they would invoice it through the company, or the fertilizer companies provide their material to a dealer. The TSO is joint with the dealer. So basically the dealer invests in the stock, and then it is the job of the TSO to kind of liquidate the stock.
What's the TSO?
The technical sales officer.
Okay.
And then the TSO is under the payroll of the company, and he is there to liquidate the stock of the dealer.
So it's
to
his responsibility to make sure that it sells, essentially.
Essentially, yes. And then your second question as to why fertilizer sales are increasing even though the arable land, the cultivatable land is the same. So it's a pretty complex question. I think my answer would be that basically I agree there's a definitely overuse of in fertilizer, especially in nitrogenous fertilizers. Log in then 6 bag urea dal rahe hain, which is an absurd quantity.
What's the optimal amount?
It depends for various crops, but no more than like 2 to 3 to 4.
Okay.
So
if you were to say for our major crops, wheat, sugarcane, cotton, rice, and corn, what would you use?
It really depends on, like, you have to first do soil tests to see how much nitrogen you have available in the ground, how much available nitrogen you have. So it really depends. But I mean, if usually people just give recommendations, it's like 2 bags in basal dose that you can give, and then another 1 or 2 bags and other split doses depending on the crop cycle.
Okay, sorry.
And
What is basal dose?
basal dose is the initial dose that you give to fertilizer when it is a seed. So when it is a seed. So basically, जो छट्टा करते हैं आप
Okay,
granular
you just
fertilizer का,
spray
you
like with
exactly,
your hand, yeah.
with your hand, or you flood it. That's like just known as the basal dose, which is the first dose of fertilizer which you give
And
to
you're
a
saying
crop.
it's like about 2 to 3 bags is probably.
Yes, that approximately of urea, and then DAP they use about 1 bag to 1.5 bag, and then only 2% of farmers actually use potash. So, your other question was why fertilizer sales are increasing. So, essentially, when you are harvesting a crop, you are taking out some nutrients from the crop. The crop takes it from the soil, then the crop onwards, like when you sell it. So, you are extracting, you are mining nutrients from your land. And as you are increasing your agricultural productivity, you also naturally have to replenish those same nutrients at the same rate.
So
So
it's a replacement.
exactly. So, and now if, if some people are trying to do like three cultivations of maize a year, three cultivations of rice a year, which is quite intensive farming. So essentially the nutrients are being mined from the land faster than they're being replenished. So hence, in order to just maintain agricultural productivity and supply of nutrients, that is why also fertilizers are, I mean, people are giving more fertilizers to their crops as well. That could be one of the reasons why. Another clear reason is that the efficiency of fertilizer is actually decreasing. So urea, one of the biggest issues is the volatilization losses, which is essentially when nitrogen dissipates into the air, and then leaching losses of nitrate, in which it basically goes below the root zone of the plant. So there's a lot of wastage of
So it's not
fertilizer.
effective.
Exactly, it's not effective. DAP is also being leached and being made and being fixed with other compounds in the ground. So that's why there's a lot of wastage. So perhaps in order to actually like pivot from that wastage, they are applying more
So
fertilizer.
they're trying to compensate
Exactly.
for what the losses might be otherwise.
Fair, yes.
Okay, now I just want to talk to the viewers a little bit about the misconceptions that people have regarding agriculture, right? When we think agriculture or farming, we think, okay, we need a seed, put it in the soil, water it, you need sunlight, and that's about it. And that you would say it's biology, right? But when you talk about fertilizers or you think agricultural inputs, it's all chemistry. So there's this tension between biology and chemistry when it comes to agriculture, right? So how do you think this sort of plays out in the last 100 years? Because maybe before the 19th century came like the onset of it happened, fertilizers wasn't really an established industry. So how did chemistry win over biology when it comes to agriculture?
So I guess a lot had to do with the Green Revolution, the Haber-Bosch process, which actually
Could you
came.
give some context?
Yeah, which is the production of urea. Essentially, the taking out. It's actually creation of ammonia, and then the ammonia, which leads to then in the urea production. So that is actually one of the absolute, like, cornerstones of agriculture, which has been there. And actually, a funny thing, a farmer once asked me that, you go to Hunza and you see these trees and they don't use fertilizer in it, but yet we get such nice fruit.
Yeah.
Like, why is that the case? 100 साल पुराना तो पहले तो fertilizer नहीं होता था और अब ये सारा इस्तेमाल हो रहा है. So an answer to that would be, firstly, those areas are also extremely fertile. They have nutrients in the ground and they have solid organic matter, microbial activity, which fosters plant growth. But the issue is that there's a difference between what we were doing 100 years ago and now having a profitable farming business. So when you look at, you can grow something with absolute minimal fertilizer in an organic way, and using organic matter and like different types of organic fertilizers, but essentially you will not be achieving that same yield. So that is the answer to your question, that in order that fertilizers are used in order to make a business essentially farming productive and profitable for the farmer.
Very
Because-
fascinating point that you've touched on. And since you mentioned organic, I might as well just ask this question right now. If the organic or regenerative revolution takes shape and really farmers start to adopt it with, the vigor that they have since the Green Revolution, do you feel as though fertilizers or the fertilizer industry will go out of business? Like, how will that sort of play out? Because what if, say, farmers have yields that are better, right, with lower costs of production because, again, the agri input cost has gone away if they're on organic farming? So, what will happen to the fertilizer industry if the organic farming or the organic agriculture movement really picks up across Pakistan?
Okay. So you mentioned organic agriculture and then regenerative. Both are quite different things. So I'll answer them differently.
For the purposes of this
Yeah.
conversation, I think if we were to, I know there are differences technically,
Yes.
but to just for our users to get an
Okay.
understanding, let's just define it as no chemical products have been used, whether it's a fertilizer, a pesticide, herbicide, a weedicide, a
Okay.
medicide.
Okay.
So that's how I would define organic or regen for the purposes of this conversation.
Okay. So I think a farmer should definitely think along those lines, but not in terms of perhaps not using fertilizer, but they should definitely look to improve their soil health, improve organic matter, improve microbial activity in their soil. There's just rules of nutrient stewardship that you should never use more than what you actually require.
More
So
than
farmers
what's
should
required.
definitely should try neo farming techniques, regenerative agriculture techniques such as like zero till, crop cover, intercropping, and such methods. Creating their own compost. These are all extremely beneficial methods that will definitely help a farmer. But I do not think in the long run it would be an excuse to use fertilizer because yes, you are making your nutrient cycling between your current crop more efficient. So what you are taking out of the land, you're also putting it back into as much degree as you can. But I mean, if you want to increase productivity and make it a far more profitable venture, then I think definitely use of chemical fertilizers will be needed, as shown
Yeah,
in the
no.
world.
I think it's a
Like-
valid argument to be made, but what the misconception here in Pakistan's specific case is that our farmers may not be as educated as we need them to be for them to make those decisions, right? About
Absolutely.
how much we need to fertilize our soil or what they need to do to improve the soil health. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is the seed that you're putting and the health of the soil. Of course, the other two elements that are super important are sunlight and the amount of water that you have available. But it's not necessary to be completely reliant on fertilizers, is what you're saying, I believe.
Exactly.
And what I think is important to take away from this is that the education of the farmers on how much water or fertilizer or any other agri input is needed is very important for them to know. And for every crop also it varies. It's not the same for every single crop.
So-
Right now, I just want to come to another question that has been playing on my mind because I've had personal experiences of it, and the doctors will attribute it to fertilizers or agricultural inputs. Do you think that agricultural inputs like herbicides or fertilizers or pesticides are causing life-threatening diseases like cancer?
So absolutely, fertilizers, synthetic chemical fertilizers are a double-edged sword. So one of the Haber-Bosch process, as I said, urea production does release a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Then there's a lot of nitrate leaching, which cause eutrophication in water bodies. So there are a plethora of issues that are also caused by this. Definitely, pesticides are as much as they kill pests, they also hurt some function of ours. So yes, indeed, definitely there are like problems caused with fertilizer, but it's also a necessary evil if you were to think about it.
Okay.
At least that is what my standpoint is. And,
No, and that's valid, but I think what's important is for our consumers to know, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, if we are eating or consuming this product, its shelf life has been increased by spraying something on it, but we don't necessarily know how harmful the chemical that has been sprayed on it to make it look green while
Absolutely.
it's waiting at the shop or at the thela or whatever, right? The idea is that if someone is putting pesticides on the crop, the guy who's doing it, he also wears a mask type thing, right?
Exactly,
To protect
absolutely,
himself.
yeah.
But
It's-
why
it
is he
is.
doing that? Because he knows that the chemical that's in there is harmful to me and my health.
So pesticides, you can think of dava, and then
Yeah, they call it dawai,
dava,
yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
and then fertilizer, you can think of food. आपकी जो
खाद
खुराक है,
कहते हैं उसको.
जो खाद है आपकी वो, you can compare that to humans खुराक. So essentially, if I am a weak person, so Norway has actually said by 2030 they want to absolutely reduce pesticide use to zero. And that's because they're able to do that if a crop is strong enough. If you fertilize the crop properly with the adequate doses of your NPK, secondary macros, and then all of your micros, and whatever, and you actually make a strong plant, then there's a very low chance that a pest attack will come. It won't be as vulnerable to a pest attack. So I think definitely in the line of defense for a crop, the first thing comes is crop nutrition, which is how healthy you are. You compare it to a human body as well. Like if you are healthy, there's a lesser of a chance that that you're going to be susceptible to like common cold, flu, these type of issues. And then pesticides are like, okay, there's a problem clearly there. How do I solve it? Its harvest is coming up. I need to fix this and make my crop, marketable. You will go spray pesticide on it to clear that short-term issue. But I think an inherent long-term problem is definitely crop nutrition and soil health.
So for that, maybe we can look into agronomy practices. But again, the issue that comes in Pakistan is it's a technical subject, right? So you got to dumb it down and you have to simplify it so that those farmers that may not be that educated or smallholders less than 12 acres under cultivation, they need to really understand the application of these agricultural inputs and use them in the right way. Because again, the incorrect usage of any product, whether it's agriculture or non-agriculture related, will be harmful to you at some extent, right? If I go and have 10 cups of chai, obviously it's not going to benefit me, right, in that moment. Or if I have 10 Panadols in one go, I'm at risk of other sort of health effects. It's not going to help my health. So I think that's the point Uzair is trying to drive home. Last couple of questions I have in regards to just how the industry plays out. Now, we know that recently, because of the IMF dictates and such, we've had rising electricity prices, we've had rising gas prices. And earlier on in our conversation, you mentioned that, they're getting free subsidized sort of, inputs on electricity and gas. Now, what I'm trying to understand is that if the fertilizer industry makes a solid profit and, its stock price on the PSX is going higher and higher, and all the investors think this is a solid thing to invest in, which it very well is if you look at its past 2 decades performance.
Absolutely.
Why does the fertilizer industry, given it's a concern of food security, pass on the cost to the consumer when majority of its consumers who are buying the fertilizer are smallholder farmers? Why can't the fertilizer industry bear the cost of the gas or the electricity itself, especially when its profits are through the roof?
So when it comes down to a subsidy, I think a subsidy may help in the short term for any country. For natural gas, of course, it has to do with food security. So I would say the subsidy where it was extremely important. But now that the subsidy has been is gone, and they're passing over all the price increase to the farmers, I think maybe it could potentially actually be a good thing, because now farmers will look for alternatives instead of just constantly using urea. And as I said, overuse of nitrogen is such a huge issue in this country. So now essentially, if a farmer would look at his own economics, maybe they would say, okay, this X bag of urea is now a bit too expensive. Let's go to other ammonical fertilizers or more efficient ones, or let's reduce our urea use and put that money towards micronutrients or potash or other type of things. So I think that internal change will come from a grassroots level, potentially from a farmer themselves in the long run. So yes, definitely it would hurt a Kisan's pockets in the beginning, having to pay higher price of urea. But I think in the long run, it might actually, like a free market, you would say, that in which the cost is being passed down to the farmer. In the long run, it might actually help, because the consumer would look for various alternatives in order to make their production more efficient. And historically, the overuse of nitrogen fertilizers came to be because of the subsidy. Essentially, one of the reasons was the subsidy. Other is कि हमारी कौम बहुत ढीठ है. But one of the reasons, but one is definitely the overuse of nitrogen fertilizer because of the subsidy. And now, because Pakistan's yields are some of the lowest in the world, but yet our nitrogen use is one of the highest. Our NUE, nitrogen use efficiency, is extremely low. So, as the subsidy goes, people might use less urea. They might use more efficient forms of urea, which are out in the market now, with different coatings, with inhibitors, mixed with sulfur, mixed with zinc, mixed with, various other things to make it slow release. So I think as time goes on, this subsidy being removed will definitely be a positive for farmers, even though it's a negative in the short term.
Okay, and how do you think we can increase our yields? If you're saying our NUE efficiency is really bad, what can be done from an agronomical perspective or crop nutrition perspective, or even from a fertilizer business perspective, obviously, because your sales are also tied to how the crop performs and how the yields are. So in that sort of a situation, what is the advice for small scale farmers, medium scale, or even potentially large or corporate farmers?
Okay, so one disclaimer, I am not an agronomist personally. I can only answer to the best of my ability in the
That's
fertilizer
completely
business
fair. We're
space.
just having a
Yes.
conversation to get
So,
more context here, right?
so in fertilizer, there are many ways that you can increase your yield just being a farmer. First is Pakistan has very, very low organic matter in our soils. So, and carbon, which is organic matter, is the basically the crux of how a crop can grow. And you need to increase your organic matter. This can be through various small ways, through applying, bacterial fertilizers or various other inputs, or you could begin mulching or create your own compost. That will undoubtedly have an effect if you have low organic matter. Then next is to actually go and get a soil test done. So in a soil test, there are two types of things. There's one that's in your soil, like what elements are there in my soil, and then there's how many are uptakeable by the plant. So there are two states.
Can you define uptakeable by the plant?
So
what
जो
that means?
जो जज्ब हो सकते हैं
Acha.
by the plant essentially. These nutrients. So for example, there could be calcium in the ground on a soil test, but when you actually see it, it will be calcium phosphate, and that calcium phosphate is not uptakeable by the plant. So you have to have a clear distinction as to your soil, what type of soil it is, loam, sandy loam, or exactly what type it is, and then उसके मुताबिक आप अपनी fertilization plan choose करें. And then in your fertilization plan, you look at your soil tests, you'll see which nutrients you have in abundance and which nutrients you have a deficiency of. And exactly that's how you would apply in a very precision way how much. So usually Pakistan soils are very low in nitrogen, phosphorus. So that's why we are, but that's why we often only replenish nitrogen and phosphorus as well, but we forget about the others, like we ignore potash, etc. So definitely use of a balanced nutrition point of view, using nitrogen, phosphorus, and hefty potassium along with your secondary macronutrients and your micronutrients needed for the specific crop will eventually result in a healthier crop and hence a better yield.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's very similar to a diet plan, right?
Exactly.
Like as humans have a diet plan, and you mentioned you compared fertilizers to food, right? So we need carbs, we need protein, we need
Absolutely.
water, we need a little bit of sweet as well. So you need all of these things to make a balanced diet. Similarly with fertilizers, you need NPK and all the other components that would not necessarily be there in your particular type of soil. So firstly, you need to identify them very closely, and then you have to have a precise way of getting them into the ground and having it absorb so that your efficiency of fertilizer application is higher.
Absolutely.
Now, we have had a brilliant conversation, and I think that the context that our viewers will get from this will be really insightful, especially
Hopefully.
for those people who might be trying to invest in fertilizer stock and want more context about the industry, or those who don't know anything about fertilizer and happen to be in agriculture, or those that have been misusing fertilizer, or those that are interested in getting in this space. Uzair,
Absolutely.
thank you for your time. And last
Thank
thing that I would ask you is just to give a message for the viewers or the farming community in regards to fertilizers.
Okay. So my message to the fertilizer, just general community would be, farmers would be, definitely have your soil tested and find out what your soil is. And don't, often in the industry, unfortunately, you see people just looking at your neighbor, seeing them do well and just copy pasting their method. There should be some innovation, there should be a personal industriousness that one should have. And if you're confused about something, in the har bande ke paas smartphone hai, Google hai, one can search up, how much fertilizer would this specific crop need, what are the application timings for this, and try to experiment. Honestly, one thing that I've noticed is that the most progressive farmers are constantly experimenting with new things. One of the biggest cornerstones of the problems in Pakistan regarding fertilization is कि वही अयूब खान के ज़माने से लोग वही fertilizer आकर इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं. So now, constantly experiment. There are innovations happening across the world in the fertilizer industry. Look at them and try to see what can be replicated in Pakistan. See what you can do, how you can make a fertilizer without money, without buying from a fertilizer company. See how you can use your own, natural resources to try to make your own fertilizer and try to reduce your cost of inputs to that. My message would be to just constantly keep experimenting and keep innovating on an absolute personal level. Do not wait for a company to offer you the best new product. Do not wait for your friend next door to tell you the best new way to do something. try your best at all times to find that out for yourself and do what works for you and how to make your venture profitable.